The dashboard clock of the 2006 Ford Taurus glowed a sickly, faltering green. 3:14 in the morning. The numbers bled into the dark like the last embers of a dying fire, and Eleanor Brennan watched them the way a drowning woman watches the surface of water she can no longer reach. She was 35 years old. She had not always lived in this car. The wind off Casco Bay came down through the streets of Portland with the meanness of an animal that had been hunting all night and found nothing. It rocked the Taurus on its tired suspension. It found every gap in the weather, stripping every place where the rubber had cracked and given up. It poured itself in around her ankles, around her ribs, around her heart. Eleanor pulled the moth-eaten wool blanket tighter. Her breath came out in small white ghosts that hung in the cold air for a moment, and then vanished as if even her breathing was something she had to do quietly, apologetically, so the world would not notice her and ask her to leave. She had parked behind a dental office on Forest Avenue. The lot was empty and unlit the way she liked them. A street light flickered down the block, throwing long, broken shadows across the dashboard. The shadow of a power line crossed her face and held there like a hand laid gently across her eyes. She closed them. She thought of her husband. Declan Brennan had been a tall, soft-spoken man with hands that had known real work. Carpenter's hands. He had a small, saw-shaped scar on the meat of his left thumb from when he was 19, and he used to rub it absently when he was thinking. He had been thinking a great deal in those last months. Sitting on the edge of the hospital bed at Mercy, the morphine drip beside him like a quiet, patient companion, he would rub that scar with his right thumb and stare at the linoleum. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctor had said the words as gently as a man can say them, and they had still landed like a hammer on a window pane. That had been the spring before last. Well, a Tuesday. It had been raining. 2 years. 2 years for the world to take everything. The medical bills had come like a river that did not know how to stop. Even with insurance, the experimental treatments had cost more than the apartment was worth. The specialists at Mercy, the trips down to Boston, the clinical trial in New Hampshire that had not worked, they had spent every saving. They had refinanced. They had cashed in the small life insurance policy Declan had taken out when they got married, the one that was supposed to be a foolish, hopeful thing for a young couple. And when Declan died, the bills did not die with him. They were inherited the way some families inherit silver, the way some inherit land. They woke her up at night. They followed her to the grocery store. They were the reason she finally stopped answering the phone. Eviction came in October. By November, she had sold the dining set her grandmother left her. By December, she had sold her wedding ring at a pawn shop on Congress Street, and the man behind the counter had not even looked at her face when he counted out the bills. He had given her $240. She had walked out of the shop and stood on the sidewalk and not been able to remember how to breathe. The Taurus was all she had left now. The Taurus in a backpack and a thermos and a small plastic toiletry bag. The Taurus was her bedroom, her kitchen, her living room, her last small province in the country of the living. She opened her eyes again. 3:15. A long minute. A patient minute. The wind hit the side of the car, and the whole vehicle shuddered, and somewhere down the alley, a metal trash can lid rolled across pavement with the sound of a bone being dragged. Eleanor pressed her palm flat against the cold window glass, the way a child might press a hand against a fish tank, and she whispered very softly to no one at all, "I am still here." It was the only prayer she had left. Outside, the November snow began to fall. Slow at first, almost shy. The flakes drifted down through the street lights' dying glow like ash from a fire she could not see. She had a routine the way a creature in winter has a routine. Wake before the sun. Move before you are seen. By 5:30, Eleanor had folded her blankets, wiped the fog from the inside of the windshield with the heel of her glove, and turned the key in the ignition. The Taurus complained. It always complained. It coughed twice and caught on the third try, and she patted the dashboard the way she would have patted an old sick dog. Easy, girl, she said, easy. She drove the long way, the back way, past the closed bakeries and the dark windows of the bookshops, until she came to the Exxon out on Route 1. The lights of the station were the warmest thing in her world. They poured out across the wet asphalt in a yellow puddle that looked from a distance like a piece of sun that had fallen out of the sky and not yet been collected. She parked at the far edge of the lot by the air pump. She picked up her toiletry bag. She walked across the lot with her chin tucked into her coat and her shoulders rounded, and she pushed open the glass door and the bell rang once small and tired. Behind the counter stood a boy of 19. His name was Jesse. He was thin and pale, and he had a long, slow way of moving, as if the world had already explained to him that there was no hurry. He wore a name tag and a hooded sweatshirt under his uniform vest, and he was reading a paperback he kept stashed beneath the register. He did not look up when Eleanor came in. That was their agreement, their unspoken contract. He never looked up at her. He never asked. He never followed her with his eyes when she walked slowly with her plastic bag toward the cramped bathroom in the back. He never said anything when she came out 20 minutes later, with her teeth brushed and her face washed and her hair combed and her dignity, however small, however damp, stitched back into place. He never said anything when she bought the smallest cup of coffee they sold and handed him exact change, sometimes in pennies. Once in October, when she had pushed her 2 crumpled dollar bills across the counter, he had silently slid one of them back. He had not looked up. He had only said in a voice as flat as a frozen lake, "It's on the house tonight, ma'am." She had stood there for a long second, and then she had picked up the dollar with a hand that was shaking, and she had gone out to the parking lot and sat in the Taurus and cried with the coffee burning her thigh through the cardboard sleeve. That kindness, the grace of small, unremarked kindnesses. It was sometimes the only thing that kept her alive. By 8 in the morning, Eleanor would drive downtown and park in the long-term lot behind the Portland Public Library. She would walk in with the office workers and the students with her backpack on her shoulder, and she would settle herself at one of the public computer terminals on the second floor. The library was warm. The library had Wi-Fi. The library did not ask why you had nowhere else to be. The hiring managers, when they wrote back politely. "We have decided to move forward with other candidates. We will keep your resume on file." She knew what that meant. It meant you are a ghost. It meant we cannot see you anymore. By noon, she would eat half of a granola bar at the corner table by the window where the radiator hissed and the sun, when there was sun, fell warm across her hands. She would drink water from the fountain. She would read the newspaper, the obituaries first, because the names of the dead had a way of making her own loneliness feel less private. By 3, she would be tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. By 5, the library would close. By 6, it would be dark again, and she would be in the Taurus again, and the cycle would begin again. That was her life. That was the small, frozen circle she had been walking for almost a year. It was a Tuesday in early November when she found the auction notice. The sleet had turned to snow over the weekend, and the city had taken on that particular Maine grayness that does not lift until April. Eleanor had a cough she could not shake. She had $14.62 in her wallet. Her bank account was overdrawn by $31, and the Taurus's gas needle was hovering trembling just above empty. She was scrolling with the dull patience of a woman with nowhere else to go through the websites of every county in Maine. She was looking for public assistance programs she had not yet exhausted. She was looking for small grants, emergency funds, anything. That was when she saw it. It was a PDF. It was poorly formatted. It looked like it had been scanned and uploaded by someone who did not really want anyone to find it. Penobscot County Delinquent Tax and Seized Property Auction. She almost clicked away. Then her eye caught the words at the bottom of the document. Lot 44, 402 Ravenwood Road, Hollow Pine. 1.2 acres. Residential structure condemned severe disrepair. Minimum starting bid $1. Eleanor stared at the screen. $1. She read it again. $1. The little forensic accountant who still lived inside her, the one who had not entirely been killed by grief, sat up. She narrowed her eyes. Why $1? Why a starting bid that low? The note at the bottom of the lot said the county had recently waived a decade's worth of accumulated fines in order, the document said, to incentivize the transfer of liability. Eleanor read that line 3 times. The county was paying in essence to be rid of this house, a house no one wanted, a house someone somewhere had stopped fighting for a long time ago. The auction was in 14 hours, 3 hours north in a small, economically depressed municipal district called Hollow Pine in the deep woods of Penobscot County. Eleanor sat back in the library chair. A condemned house was still a house. A condemned house had walls and a roof and a door that closed. A condemned house meant she could park the Taurus and not lie awake all night in terror of a flashlight tapping on the window. A condemned house was in some small and broken way an address. She closed her eyes. She thought for a long moment of Declan, of the way he used to lean against the kitchen counter on Saturday mornings in the apartment on Cumberland Avenue, drinking coffee in his old gray sweatshirt. She thought of the way he used to look at the small, foolish things she dreamed about. A porch, a garden, a red door, and not laugh at her. Never laugh at her, only lift his cup and say in that low, careful voice of his, "Take the leap, Elle." She opened her eyes. She had $14.62. She would need maybe $12 in gas to make it 3 hours north and back. She would need to bid in cash. She would need to be inside that auction room when the gavel fell, or she would need to spend another night in the Taurus and another until the cold finally took the last small thing she still owned, which was her own breathing. She logged off the computer. She picked up her threadbare backpack. She walked out of the library into a wind that smelled like winter, and she stood in front of the building for one long minute, looking up at the gray November sky. "All right, Declan," she whispered. "All right." And she went to her car. The Taurus's heater gave out 40 miles up Interstate 95. Eleanor felt it go. It was not a dramatic death. It was a small, polite cough somewhere deep in the dashboard, and then a slow falling off of the warmth on her shins until the only heat in the car was her own body and the breath she huffed into her cupped, gloved hands at every red light. She drove on. The land changed as she drove. Portland gave way to the long, low pine country of central Maine. The road narrowed. The towns thinned. By the time she crossed into Penobscot County, the trees on either side of the highway had become tall and dark and patient the way only Maine pines can be. They held the snow on their branches with a kind of dignity, as if they had been doing this for a very long time and would be doing it long after every car on this road had rusted into the ground. She passed a billboard for a hardware store that had closed in 2009. She passed the burned-out shell of a diner. She passed a hand-painted sign that said simply in white letters on a blackboard, "Jesus saves." She did not feel saved. She felt very small and very cold and very awake. She turned off the interstate at the exit for Hollow Pine, and the road narrowed again from 4 lanes to 2, from 2 to 1, from asphalt to a cracked, frost-heaved tar that whined under the Taurus's tires. The sky over the trees had gone the color of old pewter. A red-tailed hawk lifted off a fence post as she passed and beat its way slowly north against the wind. Hollow Pine was the kind of town that the rest of America had forgotten. Main Street ran for 3 short blocks. There was a post office, a feed store, a coin laundry with one window taped up with cardboard, and a diner whose sign said with a flickering letter open. There was a small white church with a tilted steeple. There was a Civil War monument in the middle of a brown patch of grass, and the names cut into its stone had been worn so smooth by 150 years of Maine winters that you could almost not read them anymore. The Hollow Pine Municipal Building sat at the far end of Maine, a long, flat cinder block thing the color of old teeth. The parking lot was gravel. Eleanor pulled in, turned off the engine, and listened for one long moment to the tick of the cooling motor and to the sound of her own heart. She had $8.90 left. She got out. Inside, the building smelled of bleach and percolating coffee and the kind of dampness that lives in the corners of old basements. A handwritten sign with an arrow said auction in the auxiliary gym. She followed it. The gym was small, concrete floor, low fluorescent lights, the painted lines of a long faded basketball court still ghosting up through the gray. About 30 folding chairs had been set out in rows. About 30 people were sitting in them. She felt their eyes on her the moment she walked in. They were contractors mostly. Big men in heavy Carhartt jackets with sawdust still in the cuffs. There were a few real estate investors from out of town, men in expensive parkas and brand new boots clutching glossy folders. There was a thin, nervous-looking couple in their 50s who looked like they were here to bid on a hunting cabin. And there was in the second row a heavy-set man in a charcoal suit and a charcoal overcoat. He had not taken the overcoat off. He had not taken his leather gloves off either. He had a sheaf of papers in one hand and a styrofoam cup of coffee in the other, and he was holding court. His voice was loud and pleased with itself, the way some men's voices are pleased with themselves all the way down to the bones. "I tell you what, Frank," he was saying to the man beside him, "I cleaned up on those Bangor flips last quarter. Cleaned up. You buy a foreclosure, you slap some paint on it, you mark it up 40%, and the millennials line up to overpay. They'll do anything to leave their parents' basement." The man called Frank chuckled. The big man laughed at his own joke. It was a wet, comfortable laugh. A name tag was clipped lopsided to the lapel of his charcoal coat. T. Marlowe. Eleanor took a seat in the back row. She made herself small. She tucked her chin into her scarf and pressed her gloved hands flat between her knees and watched the back of the room. At precisely 9 in the morning, a thin, exhausted man in a brown sweater stepped up to a folding table at the front. He tapped the microphone. Feedback shrieked through the gym like a wounded gull. The room flinched. "All right," the man said. He had reading glasses pushed up onto his bald scalp and a clipboard in one hand. "Let's get this over with. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm the Penobscot County Clerk. The standard rules apply. Properties are sold, as is where is. The county makes no guarantees. Cash or certified check at the conclusion of the auction." Briggs looked out across the room over the tops of his glasses. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been doing the same job for a very long time. "Lot 1, he said. The auction began. The good lots went first. They always do. A foreclosed brick storefront on the edge of town went for $78,000. A small farmhouse with 60 acres of timber went for 112. The bidding wars were short and sharp. Hands shot up. Numbers climbed. Briggs called them out in his flat, tired voice, and the gavel fell and the contractors and investors stood up one by one to go sign their papers. The crowd thinned. By 10:30, only the dregs were left. The lots no one wanted. The leftover puddles of municipal liability. Briggs sighed, glanced down at his clipboard, and pushed his glasses up his nose. Lot 44, he said. Eleanor's heart began to climb. Lot 44, 402 Ravenwood Road, Hollow Pine, 1.2 acres. Primary structure has severe foundational damage, partial roof collapse. Officially condemned by the Penobscot County Board of Health in 2013. The county is looking primarily to transfer the deed for land clearing purposes. Minimum bid is $1. A silence, and then Tad Marlowe in the second row snorted loudly. You'd have to pay me 10 grand just to haul the asbestos out of that dump, he announced to no one and to everyone. He turned in his seat and grinned, looking for the laugh, and a couple of the contractors gave him a tired half chuckle to be polite. Marlowe turned back satisfied. Briggs scanned the room. Do I have $1, he said. $1 for lot 44. Going once. Eleanor's hand shook so hard she had to use her other hand to hold it up. $1, she said. Her voice came out raspy, small, half-eaten by the cold. But it carried in the way that small things sometimes carry in a quiet room. Briggs blinked. He looked toward the back of the gym. I have $1 in the back. For a moment, nothing happened, and then from the side, a bored voice spoke up. It belonged to the local farmer, a heavy man in a green John Deere cap, with a face like a weathered fence post. $5, he said. He was not interested in the house. Eleanor understood that immediately. He just wanted the acre and a bit the field, maybe for grazing or for hay. He had not even taken his hands out of his coat pockets. Eleanor's breath hitched. She had $8.90 left in this world after ish and the toll. If he bid 8, she was finished. She was going home, if you could call it home, in a Taurus with no heater and no money for the next tank. She raised her hand again. $7, she said. The farmer turned in his seat. He looked at her. He took her in. He saw the worn coat, the wool hat, the hollow under her cheekbones. He saw her hands, which were shaking. He saw her eyes, which were not. He held her gaze for one long second, and then very slowly he lowered his hand. He shook his head almost to himself. He gave us across the cold gymnasium a small, sad nod, the way one tired soldier nods to another at the end of a long day. All yours, ma'am, he said quietly. Briggs looked around the room. I have $7, he said. Any other bids? 8, no, going once, going twice. In the second row, Tad Marlowe had turned in his seat. He was not laughing now. His coffee cup was still in his hand, but he had stopped raising it. He was looking at Eleanor. His eyes were small and pale and very still. They were the eyes of a man who had just been told the punchline of a joke and was deciding whether or not it had been at his expense. The gavel came down. Sold, Briggs said to the lady in the back for $7. A few people clapped half-heartedly. The contractors began to pack up their folders. The room resumed its slow, hungry rumble of conversation. The auction moved on. Eleanor sat very still in her metal chair, and tears that she had not cried for almost a year ran silently down her face and into the wool of her scarf. She had against everything won. She crossed the room on legs that did not feel like legs. She handed her crumpled bills, a 5 and 2 ones, to a deeply confused county clerk. She signed with a hand that trembled a stack of liability waivers as long as her arm. The waivers told her in plain language that the structure on Lot 44 was unsafe to enter, that the county would not be responsible for any injury, illness, or death she sustained on the property, and that by accepting the deed, she accepted all liability. She signed every page. When the deed was finally in her hands, freshly stamped, the paper still warm from the printer, she stood there for a moment holding it the way a woman might hold a newborn. She did not see as she walked out of the gym that Tad Marlowe was watching her. She did not see that he had taken a small leather notebook from his coat pocket. She did not see that he was writing in careful, neat handwriting a single line. Lot 44, Briar Widow, $7. Look into. The drive from the municipal building to Ravenwood Road took 22 minutes. The pavement gave out after the first 6. Asphalt became cracked. Tar became gravel. Gravel became a deep-rutted dirt track that bent into the woods like a vein. The Taurus complained, it bumped and lurched and groaned. Eleanor crawled along at 15 miles an hour, both hands on the wheel, and the gray pines closed in on either side of her like a long, slow corridor. She came around a final curve, and there it was. The clearing was silent. Eleanor turned off the engine. The silence rushed in. She had not heard a silence like this in 2 years. In Portland, there was always something. Sirens, traffic, voices, the hum of the city. Here, there was only the small ticking of the cooling motor and the sigh of the wind in the high pines and her own breathing, very slow, very careful, as if the silence itself were a thing that might startle and run. She got out. The cold hit her. She pulled her coat tighter and walked slowly up the gravel path to the porch. The boards groaned under her weight. She half expected her foot to break through. It didn't. The front door was locked. She could see even in the dim gray light that the wood around the deadbolt was rotten clear through, soft as a sponge. She set her shoulder against the door and gave it one firm shove, the way Declan had taught her years ago when they had been young and renting their first apartment with a sticky lock. The door groaned and swung inward on hinges red with rust. She stepped inside. The smell hit her first. It was the smell of an old house that had been left to die. Mildew and dust and animal droppings and a damp, deep mineral cold that seemed to live in the floorboards. Eleanor took out her phone and turned on the flashlight in the cone of pale white light cut through the gloom. The living room opened up on her left. It was cavernous in the way a dead church is cavernous. A fireplace on the far wall had collapsed inward. The bricks tumbled across a hearth thick with leaves. Above her, a gaping hole in the ceiling let in a single column of gray daylight, and through it she could see the rafters and the underside of the broken roof. The floorboards were warped and curled like dead leaves in the places where rain had reached them. To her right was a kitchen once, long ago. The cabinets had no doors. The sink was rust-stained and crooked. The linoleum had peeled up from the floor and lay in long, dry curls. An old wood stove, cast iron, squatted in the corner like a black patient toad. It was by any measure a real estate agent could use uninhabitable. It was by every measure that mattered to Eleanor Brennan a miracle. She stood in the middle of the kitchen for a long minute. The wind moved through the broken upstairs windows somewhere above her with a long, hollow hush, and she realized slowly that she could not feel that wind on her face. She was inside a building. A roof, however broken, was over her head. Walls, however rotten, were around her. For the first time in 11 months and 23 days, she was not in her car. She set her backpack down on a relatively dry patch of floor in the southeast corner of the kitchen, where a portion of the ceiling above was still intact. She unrolled her sleeping bag. She set out her thermos and her last granola bar and her flashlight. All right, she said out loud to the empty rotting room. Her voice cracked on the words. All right, we can work with this. She spent 3 hours dragging out debris. She hauled an old mildewed couch cushion out the front door and dropped it in the weeds. She swept her corner with a broken broom she found in a closet. She wedged a sheet of plastic she had brought from the car over a hole in the wall above her sleeping bag, and she taped it down with the silver duct tape Declan had always kept in the trunk for emergencies. The November sun, what there was of it, slid westward through the cracks in the boarded windows. The light went from gray to gold to a deep copper. Long shadows lengthened across the living room. The temperature, which had been cold all day, began to drop in earnest. Eleanor sat down with her back against the kitchen wall in the southeast corner in the small clean square of her own making. She unwrapped the granola bar. She bit into it. She listened. The house was full of the small noises an old house makes when it thinks no one is listening. The settle of an old beam, the skitter of something small in the attic, the low whistle of wind through a gap somewhere upstairs. She had grown up in a house older than this one in a small town outside Bangor, and she knew these noises. They did not frighten her. Then she heard something that did. It came from the wall behind her. It was not the wind. It was not the settling of an old beam. It was a slow, rhythmic scratching, faint at first, almost shy, like fingernails dragging slowly down the inside of the plaster. It came in a pattern, 3 slow scratches, a pause, 3 more, then it stopped. And then distinctly deeply somewhere behind the lath and plaster at the small of her back, there was a low hollow thud. The sound vibrated through the floorboards and up into her spine. Eleanor did not move. She held her breath. The thud came again, and then again. Something inside the wall had shifted and was shifting. Her first thought was an animal, a raccoon maybe, a nest of them. They got into old houses. They tore up insulation and built dens in attics. She had read once that they could weigh 30 pounds and were vicious if cornered. Her second thought was worse. A squatter, a man, some other person who had found this place before her, who had been living in the cellar, who had heard her arrive that morning and been waiting very patiently for the sun to set. Her third thought was the one that finally got her up. If it was either, she could not stay here. She rose carefully. Her knees popped. She picked up the flashlight in her left hand. She walked very softly to the front door. She slipped out onto the porch and across the broken steps and through the dead grass to the Taurus. She popped the trunk. She had in there beneath a pile of dirty laundry and a crumpled emergency blanket the small toolbox Declan had always kept by the spare tire. He had been a careful man about cars. He had not believed in being stranded. Her fingers gone numb in the cold fumbled across the contents. A flashlight with a dead battery, a pair of jumper cables, a thin nylon toe strap, a rag, a wrench small, a wrench larger, and there at the bottom the heavy weight of a 4-way cross-wrench tire, the kind shaped like a plus sign, with a different lug nut size on each of its 4 ends. She closed her hand around its cold steel. She walked back to the house, the tire iron held low and heavy at her side. Inside the kitchen was darker than it had been 10 minutes before. The sun had finally given up. She turned the flashlight on and laid its beam across the wall behind her sleeping bag. "Hello," she called. Her voice was thin in the cavernous room. "I have a weapon." Silence. Only the wind in the eaves very far away. She took a breath. She raised the tire iron. She swung. The plaster wall, weakened by 90 years of moisture and neglect, gave with a sound like dry bones breaking. A cloud of pale gray dust bloated outward, and Eleanor coughed and pressed her sleeve to her mouth and swung again. The lath splintered. A third swing tore a hole the size of a dinner plate. A fourth widened it to the size of a television screen. She lifted the flashlight. She aimed the beam into the dark cavity inside the wall. There was no animal. There was no man. There was resting on a sturdy crossbeam between two wooden studs an object. Eleanor's breath stopped. It was a box, a heavy iron box about the size of a microwave wrapped tightly in some kind of dark, decaying oilcloth that had begun to flake away in long sheets at her touch. The brass corners of the box had gone green with age. A heavy padlock secured the front clasp. The scratching she now understood had been a loose brick from the chimney behind sliding slowly down the inside of the wall over the course of a week, finally tapping against the iron lid of this hidden thing. She reached in with both hands. The box was unbelievably heavy. She had to brace her feet against the floorboards and pull again, and at last the box came out of its hiding place with a long, low scraping sound and dropped to the kitchen floor with a thud that shook the warped boards under her knees. She knelt. She set the flashlight on the floor beam, pointed up at the ceiling so that the room filled with a soft, indirect light. The padlock was so corroded that the hasp had practically rusted through. She wedged the flat tip of the tire iron under and bore down with the weight of her whole body, and with a sharp metallic snap, the lock gave way. She lifted the lid. The inside of the box was dry, bone dry. Beneath the iron, someone had lined it carefully with a layer of cedar, and the cedar had done what cedar does. It had kept the damp out for 100 years. Resting on top of everything was a thick leather-bound ledger. Eleanor lifted it out very carefully with both hands. The leather was soft and worn and warm somehow in the cold of the kitchen. She opened the cover. The first page bore in a meticulous, looping cursive that belonged to another century an inscription. Property of Cornelius Whitfield. Begun this 14th day of June in the year of our Lord 1927. Eleanor knew that name. Eleanor's hands had begun to shake. She set the ledger down very gently on the floor. She looked at what lay underneath. It was paper. Stack upon stack of pristine, crisp paper bound with brittle paper bands. Even in the dim light of the flashlight, she could see that this paper was not ordinary. She lifted the top stack out. She held the topmost bill up to the light. A man's portrait, a long, stern face. Grover Cleveland, the denomination printed in the corners, 1,000. The seal printed in a brilliant, glittering, untouched gold ink. Gold certificate, United States of America, series of 1928. Eleanor's mouth went dry. She knew vaguely what these were. Anyone who had ever taken a high school history class knew. In 1933, in the depths of the Great Depression, President Roosevelt had signed an executive order making it a federal crime for private citizens to hoard gold or gold certificates. The certificates had been ordered surrendered. Most of them had been collected and burned. To find one in this condition, uncirculated, looked like it had been printed last week, was almost unimaginable. To find a stack of them, she lifted the next stack out, and the next. The portraits changed. William McKinley, $500, the gold seal again. Another stack, another portrait, another denomination. There were dozens of stacks, and beneath the stacks of paper at the bottom of the box were 3 heavy velvet pouches. Eleanor's hands were trembling so hard she could barely work the drawstring of the first one. She pulled it open. She tipped the pouch into her cupped palm. Heavy gold coins spilled out. They clinked against one another with a small, bright, musical sound that she had never in her life heard before. They were untarnished. They glowed in the flashlight beam like tiny captured suns. She picked one up. It was a coin she would only later learn the full name of. A 1907 St. Gaudens double eagle in the rare high-relief variety designed by the sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens at the personal request of President Theodore Roosevelt. On its face, Lady Liberty stepped forward into the dawn, a torch in one hand, an olive branch in the other. It was widely considered by people who knew about such things the most beautiful coin ever struck by the United States Mint. Eleanor did not yet know any of this. She knew only that the coin in her palm was warm with the small heat of her own hand and that it was very, very heavy and that there were two more pouches beneath the first. She sat back on her heels on the cold, rotted kitchen floor in a condemned farmhouse in the dark woods of Penobscot County, and she began very quietly to cry. Not the way she had cried at her husband's funeral. Not the way she had cried in the pawn shop on Congress Street. This was a different crying. It was the crying of a woman who had been holding something heavy for a very long time and who had just been told in a small, whispered voice by a hand she could not see that she could put it down now. She held the coin tightly in her fist, and she pressed her fist to her mouth, and her shoulders shook, and the wind moved softly in the eaves of Cornelius Whitfield's old farmhouse, as if the house itself were exhaling after a very long silence, a very long-held breath. It was 4:12 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in early November, in the second year of Eleanor Brennan's widowhood. And somewhere 3 counties to the south in a corner office in Bangor, a heavy-set man in a charcoal suit was sitting at a wide mahogany desk looking at a single line in his neat handwriting. Lot 44, Briar Widow, $7, look into. He picked up his telephone. He dialed a number from memory. When the line connected, he did not bother with a greeting. "It's Marlowe," he said. "I need you to find out everything you can about a woman who bought a piece of land north of Hollow Pine this morning. And I mean everything." Outside the windows of his office, the snow was beginning to fall on the city of Bangor. Outside the windows of an old farmhouse on Ravenwood Road, the snow was beginning to fall too. It fell on the broken roof and on the rusted Ford Taurus parked in the dead grass and on the long pine woods that stretched dark and patient all the way to the Canadian border. It fell on Eleanor Brennan kneeling alone in the kitchen, holding a 100-year-old gold coin in a hand that would not stop shaking. It fell on the beginning of a story whose ending no one yet knew. She did not sleep. Eleanor knelt on the warped kitchen floorboards for a long time after the crying stopped, with the gold coin still pressed against her cheek, and she let the cold of the iron box and the cold of the floor and the cold of the long Maine night settle into her bones until she finally slowly began to think again. The first thing she thought was a single sharp word: hide. She was a widow alone in the woods. She was 3 hours from the nearest city. She had no locked door. She had no security system. She had no neighbors. She had instead a fortune and untraceable historical currency sitting in plain view on a rotting kitchen floor, and a tired old Ford Taurus that any determined thief could break into with a flathead screwdriver. She moved. She moved with the steady, focused precision of a woman who had spent 11 years balancing the books of small businesses and tracing the ghosts of fraud through long columns of figures. The grief that had numbed her for 2 years did not entirely leave her, but it stepped aside quietly the way a tired animal steps aside for a younger one. She wrapped each velvet pouch in a layer of her own clothing: her old gray wool sweater, the spare flannel shirt from her backpack, the second pair of jeans she rarely wore. She wrapped each stack of bills in a t-shirt. She placed everything back into the iron box in the same order she had found it with the leather ledger of Cornelius Whitfield resting on top the way it had rested for 97 years. She lowered the lid. She wedged the broken padlock back into place where it would at least look, in poor light, like a lock that still functioned. Then she dragged the box 3/4 of an inch at a time out of the kitchen, across the warped living room floor, through the front door, down the broken porch steps, across the dead grass to the trunk of the Taurus. It took her 18 minutes. She had to stop twice to catch her breath. The wind off the pines bit through her coat as if her coat were not there. By the time she got the box hoisted with both arms and her right knee braced against the bumper into the trunk, she was shaking. She buried the box under everything she owned. Dirty laundry on top. 2 thin blankets over the laundry. The emergency blanket, the silver mylar one draped over the blondness. Her backpack on top of the mylar. A half-empty plastic milk jug she used as a water bottle on top of the backpack. To anyone glancing into the trunk of a tired old sedan, it would look like exactly what it was supposed to look like. The trunk of a homeless woman's car. She closed the trunk softly. She did not slam it. She walked around to the driver's side, got and locked all 4 doors with the manual lock buttons one at a time, and slid the tire iron across her lap. Then she sat. 3:14 in the morning came again. She watched the green dashboard clock click to it the way she had watched it click to it from 100 other lots and 100 other nights. And she felt for the first time in those 100 nights that the clock was not mocking her anymore. She watched the long pines. She watched the long, dark driveway that led up from Ravenwood Road. She listened with the careful, alert silence of a deer for the sound of any engine that might be coming up that driveway in the dark. No engine came, only the wind. Only the slow, soft tick of the Taurus's cooling motor and the distant call of an owl somewhere out in the timber and her own breath fogging the windshield in slow, even clouds. By the time the sky began to turn from black to slate somewhere around 6 in the morning, Eleanor Brennan had made a decision. She was going to Bangor. She did not know yet exactly what Bangor would mean, but she knew that what was in the trunk of her car was not money in any modern sense of the word. It was history. It was contraband. It was a thing that had been hidden, and the people who hide things hide them for reasons that do not always die when the hider does. She would need an expert. She would need a man who knew exactly what these objects were and exactly what they were worth and exactly how a person might turn them slowly and legally and quietly into the kind of money you could put in an ordinary bank. She turned the key. The Taurus coughed caught, settled into its tired idle. She backed out of the dead grass and onto Ravenwood Road, and she pointed the car south. Bangor sat under a low sky. She drove down State Street with one hand on the wheel and the other on the small plastic sandwich bag in her coat pocket. Inside the bag, wrapped in an old paper napkin, were 2 objects. One 1928 $1,000 gold certificate, one 1907 high-relief double eagle. She had chosen them as her samples, the way a woman entering a strange country might choose a single coin from her purse to test whether the currency was good. She had left the iron box in the trunk. She had parked the Taurus 3 blocks from her destination on a side street in the shadow of a tall brick warehouse where no one was likely to look twice at a tired old car. The destination was a narrow shop wedged between a tailor and a closed bookstore on Hammond Street. Ashford and Sons, Historical Antiquities, established 1947. The lettering on the front window had been gold once. It was now the soft, dignified bronze of old gold that had spent 70 years catching the morning light. Inside, behind the glass, a single Civil War infantry rifle stood in a brass-fitted display case beside a faded daguerreotype of a young man in a Union officer's uniform. The bell above the door rang once small and clear when Eleanor pushed it open. The shop smelled of lemon polish and old paper and a distant trace of pipe tobacco that no one had smoked in a long time. Glass display cases lined the walls. They held coins, metal stamps, ribbons, bound stacks of historical letters tied with faded silk. A grandfather clock in the back corner ticked steadily. The floor of dark hardwood did not creak. A man emerged from the back room. He was Eleanor Judge, somewhere near 70. He was small, neat, gray-bearded, with the upright bearing of a man who had once been in the military and had never entirely left it. He wore a tweed waistcoat over a starch white shirt, and a pair of half-moon reading glasses had been pushed up onto a head of thinning silver hair. A jeweler's loop hung on a thin chain around his neck. His eyes were a pale, intelligent gray. They went over Eleanor in one calm, professional glance, and they did not flinch from what they saw. The wool hat, the threadbare coat, the dark circles under her eyes, the hand that came out of her pocket holding a small, folded sandwich bag, the way another woman might have held a child. "Good morning," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "I'm Bartholomew Ashford. How may I be of service?" "I have," Eleanor said, and her voice, after the long sleepless night, came out as a rasp. "2 items I would like appraised, and possibly sold." Ashford gave a small, courteous nod. He gestured to a velvet appraisal mat on the long glass counter at the back of the shop. He walked behind the counter without hurry. He set on the velvet a small pair of white cotton gloves and a fresh sheet of acid-free paper. "By all means," he said, "let us see what you have." Eleanor's hands were not quite steady as she opened the sandwich bag. She slid the contents out onto the velvet. The world held its breath. Bartholomew Ashford had been in the trade for 51 years. He had appraised the estate of 2 former governors of Maine. He had once been called to Boston to authenticate a single coin for a private collector, and the collector, when shown the certificate, had wept. Ashford had developed in those 51 years an absolutely controlled professional face. That face did not control itself now. The color left it. He stood very still with his hands resting on the edge of the counter, and he looked at the 2 objects on the velvet, and he did not move for a long moment. That became another long moment. "May I?" he said. His voice had gone soft. "Yes," Eleanor said. He drew on the cotton gloves with the slow deliberateness of a surgeon. He picked up the bill first. He held it under the bright halogen lamp that hung over the counter. He pulled the loop down from its chain and pressed it into his right eye and leaned over the paper. He examined the watermark. He examined the seal. He examined the serial number. He turned the bill over and examined the reverse. He set the bill down. He picked up the coin. He turned it slowly under the lamp. He looked at the high-relief image of Lady Liberty, at the small detail of the wire rim, at the date at the mint mark at the edge. He set the coin down beside the bill. He took the loop out of his eye. He took off the cotton gloves one finger at a time and laid them carefully on the counter beside the velvet. He drew in a long, slow breath. He looked up at Eleanor. "Ma'am," he said, "I am going to ask you 2 questions. I would like you to answer both of them honestly." Eleanor nodded. "Do you have any idea," he said, "what these are?" "Some," Eleanor said. "Not all." "And did you," he said, "acquire them legally?" She reached into her coat. She drew out the freshly stamped deed from yesterday's auction, folded once in the middle. She set it on the counter between them. "I bought a house," she said. "Lot 44, Penobscot County tax auction. Yesterday, $7. I found these inside the walls." Bartholomew Ashford looked down at the deed. He looked up at her face. He looked back down at the deed. He picked up the document. He read it. He nodded once slowly. He set it back on the counter. "Mrs. Brennan," he said. "Eleanor," she said, "please." Eleanor did not speak. The coin, Ashford continued, is a 1907 St. Gaudens double eagle, the high-relief variety, designed by Augustus St. Gaudens at the personal commission of President Theodore Roosevelt. This particular variety was struck only briefly because the high-relief design required so many strikes from the press to bring up the detail that the mint deemed it impractical for circulation. It is widely considered the most beautiful coin ever struck by the United States Mint. He paused. "At a properly conducted public auction," he said, "to the right buyer in the present market, the coin alone is worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $60,000. The bill somewhere in the neighborhood of $30,000. Combined, you have placed approximately $90,000 of historical currency on my counter this morning." The air in the shop did something strange. Eleanor reached out and laid her right hand flat on the edge of the glass case to steady herself. The shop did not actually move, but it felt as though the floor under her feet were tilting very slowly to one side. $90,000 for 2 pieces. She thought of the dozens of stacks of bills still in the trunk of the Taurus. She thought of the 3 velvet pouches. She thought of the hundreds of coins. The math she did in her head, very fast, was a kind of math that did not entirely fit in her head. "Mr. Ashford," she said carefully, there are more." Bartholomew Ashford had been about to say something. He stopped. He looked at her. "More," he said. "Many more," Eleanor said. A long silence. Bartholomew Ashford set both his hands flat on the glass counter. He looked down at his own knuckles for a moment. The grandfather clock in the back of the shop ticked. The traffic on Hammond Street moved softly past the window. Somewhere 2 streets away, a church bell rang the half hour. When Ashford looked up again, his pale gray eyes had become very calm and very serious. "Eleanor," he said, "I want you to listen to me carefully. I am not going to buy these from you today. I could. The price I could quote you in cash right now would be considerably less than what they are worth, and I am not in the business of robbery, no matter how long the line of dealers in this country who are. What I am going to do instead is propose 3 things." She nodded. "1, I am going to write you this afternoon a personal cash advance of $20,000. A loan, drawn against my own funds, repayable to me when and only when your full collection has been authenticated and brought to public auction. We will draw up papers. 2, I am going to walk with you this morning the 2 blocks from the shop to the First Main Savings Bank, where I have held a private vault since 1976. I am going to arrange for you a secure climate-controlled deposit box, large enough for your collection under your own name, with armed escort during the transfer. You will hold the only key. 3, I am going to broker your collection on your behalf through Sotheby's of New York, where I have personally placed 12 significant lots over the last 20 years. I will charge you my standard brokerage commission, not a penny more." He paused. "In return," he said, "I am going to ask one thing of you." "Yes," Eleanor said. "You are going to tell no one," he said quietly, "what you have. Not a friend, not a relative, not a clerk, not a deputy, not a kindly stranger. Until your collection is authenticated and under contract with a major auction house, the existence of this collection does not leave the 4 walls of my shop. Do you understand me, Eleanor?" She thought of Tad Marlowe in the second row of the auction gym turning in his seat. She thought of his small, pale eyes. "I understand," she said. Bartholomew Ashford nodded once. Then he said, "Let us begin." That evening, for the first time in 11 months and 24 days, Eleanor Brennan slept in a bed. The Bangor Marriott on Main Street had a king-size mattress and a cream-colored down comforter and 4 pillows in white linen cases, and Eleanor stood at the foot of the bed for a long time after she came up from the lobby with her old backpack still on her shoulder and looked at the bed the way a person looks at something they are not certain they are allowed to touch. She had eaten downstairs in the restaurant a medium-rare ribeye steak with mashed potatoes and a small dish of green beans and a slice of chocolate cake afterward, and a glass of red wine. The bill had come to $58. She had paid for it in cash from the envelope of crisp 20s Bartholomew Ashford had counted out for her at his desk that afternoon, and she had tipped the waitress 30% because the waitress had refilled her water glass 3 times without asking and had not looked once at Eleanor's coat. In her room on the 7th floor, she stood under the hot shower for 38 minutes. She watched in the small water at her feet the slow drain of the grime of 2 years. It did not all come off. Some of it had gone deeper than skin, but what came off, and when she finally turned the water off and wrapped herself in a hotel robe so thick it felt like a coat, she stood in the steam bathroom mirror and did not entirely recognize the woman looking back at her. She crossed the carpet to the bed. She drew back the comforter. She slid between sheets that smelled of clean detergent. The mattress did not give the way the Taurus's seats gave. It held her, and it kept holding her, and she lay there with her eyes open, looking at the ceiling, and she thought of Declan. She thought of the way his hand had felt in those last weeks at Mercy, when he would reach across the rail of the hospital bed and take her hand and squeeze it without speaking. She thought of how he had looked at her on their last morning when she had bent down to kiss his forehead before going down to the cafeteria for coffee, and how he had said with what was already barely a voice, "You're gonna be all right, Elle." She had not believed him. She had nodded and smiled and gone down for the coffee, and when she had come back, the room had been quiet in a way that no room had ever been quiet before. She closed her eyes now in the Marriott in Bangor on a king-size mattress under a clean white comforter, and she said very softly to the ceiling and to the dark and to her husband, "You were right, December. I think I might need to be." Then she slept. She slept for 11 hours. The phone woke her. It was 8:47 in the morning. Pale Maine sun came through the gap in the heavy hotel curtains and laid one long white stripe across the foot of her bed. Her phone on the nightstand was buzzing, a number she did not recognize. She picked up. "Eleanor Brennan," she said. "Mrs. Brennan." A man's voice, tight, nervous. "This is Walter Briggs from the auction? The county clerk, Penobscot County." She sat up. "Mr. Briggs, yes, good morning." "I'm calling," he said, "regarding the property you purchased on Tuesday. Lot 44. I am very sorry to be the one to tell you this, but I need to inform you that an emergency injunction was filed this morning in Penobscot County Superior Court." The room went very still. "An injunction," Eleanor said. "A motion to vacate the deed, ma'am. A man named Thaddeus Marlowe is contesting the auction. His attorneys are asking the court to rule the sale invalid." Eleanor's hand tightened on the phone. "Vacate it," she said. "On what grounds, Mr. Briggs?" Briggs cleared his throat. He sounded even on the phone as if he had not slept either. "He is claiming," Briggs said, "that the county improperly zoned the property in 1978. He has produced an old land survey dated 1952, which he says establishes that the structure on Lot 44, the farmhouse, is not actually situated on Lot 44. He says it is situated on Lot 45, which he purchased 2 years ago. He is asserting, ma'am, that the structure and everything inside it belongs to him." The clean white comforter across Eleanor's lap suddenly felt very heavy. "Everything inside it," she said. "That's the language his attorneys used, yes. everything situated upon and within the structure. Mrs. Brennan, his lawyers are very, very expensive. I have been a county clerk for 26 years, and I have not seen a filing this aggressive on a tax auction property in all that time. They have already asked the court for a sheriff's lockout. I am calling you as a courtesy because I felt you ought to know before they served you what is coming. Eleanor closed her eyes. She thought of Tad Marlowe in the second row turning in his seat. He knows. She did not say it out loud. She did not need to. She knew with the cold certainty of a woman who had spent 11 years finding the small wrong notes in long columns of figures that Thaddeus Marlowe had not filed an emergency injunction over a rotting farmhouse he had publicly called a dump. He had filed it because between the moment the gavel fell on Tuesday morning and the moment her phone rang on Wednesday morning, somebody had told him, or he had figured out that there was a reason a homeless widow had fought for one specific house. He did not know what was in the box, but he knew there was a box. Eleanor opened her eyes. She looked across the hotel room at the gray Maine sky outside the window. She thought for one bright, clear moment of the freezing nights in the Taurus and of the bills from Mercy Hospital and of the pawn shop on Congress Street and of the man behind the counter who had not looked at her face. She had in those years lost a great deal. She had lost her husband. She had lost her home. She had lost her job and her ring and her grandmother's table and the small, ordinary dignity of having an address. She had not, she realized, lost her spine. Her spine was in fact the only thing left that no one had taken. "Mr. Briggs," she said, her voice had become steady. "Thank you for calling. I appreciate the courtesy. Please tell Mr. Marlowe's attorneys when they reach out that they may direct all further communication to my counsel." "Your counsel?" Briggs said. "Mrs. Brennan, do you have counsel?" "I will," Eleanor said, "by this afternoon." She hung up. She sat on the edge of the bed for 1 minute. Then she stood. She showered. She dressed in the same clothes she had worn the day before because she did not own any others. She rode the elevator down to the lobby. At the front desk, she asked the concierge a single question in a voice that had somewhere in the last 10 minutes found a register it had not used in 2 years. "I need," she said, "the name of the most aggressive property attorney in the state of Maine." The concierge, a young woman with a brass nameplate, blinked once. She picked up her phone. She made 2 calls. When she hung up, she wrote a name on a hotel notepad, tore the page off, and slid it across the marble counter to Eleanor. The name on the paper in blue ballpoint was Lawrence Hayes. The offices of Hayes and Whitcomb Attorneys at Law occupied the top floor of a 4-story brick building on Exchange Street. The reception was paneled in dark walnut. The carpet was thick and quiet. A young woman at the front desk wore a string of small pearls and answered the phone in a voice as smooth as poured cream. Lawrence Hayes was 65 years old. He had silver hair combed back from a high forehead, a face that had lost its softness somewhere around the time he made partner, and a pair of eyes the color of cut glass. He wore an unflashy gray suit. The cufflinks at his wrist were small, plain, and gold. He listened. That was the first thing Eleanor noticed about him. He did not interrupt. He did not take notes for the first 10 minutes. He sat behind his wide oak desk with his fingers steepled in front of his chin, and he listened, and the only sound in the office was Eleanor's voice and the faint hum of the radiator, and once the distant honk of a delivery truck on the street below. She told him about the auction. She told him about the $7. She told him about the call from Walter Briggs. She did not, on Bartholomew Ashford's careful counsel, tell him yet about the iron box. When she finished, Lawrence Hayes lowered his hands. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, "Mr. Marlowe is what we in the trade refer to as a scavenger. He buys cheap adjacent lots in rural counties, and he uses frivolous boundary disputes to pressure his neighbors into selling to him at a loss. He has done it by my count at least 7 times in the last decade in 3 different counties. I have personally faced his counsel twice. Both times we settled. Both times my client took less than they should have because they could not afford to keep fighting. He paused. That is his business model, Hayes said. It is not a clever one, but it is unfortunately an effective one. Eleanor swallowed. How does he do it? She said. In Maine real estate law, Hayes said boundary disputes are settled almost always by whichever party can produce the oldest legally recorded undisputed survey of the disputed line. Mr. Marlowe has a survey from 1952. The county records pertaining to your property predate that, but most of them were destroyed in the Penobscot County Courthouse fire of 1958. So there is on paper no documented survey older than his. Without a survey older than his, the court will more likely than not grant his injunction to clear the record, to save the headache. Which would mean, Eleanor said, that everything on the property, every nail and every floorboard becomes his. By the language he has filed, Hayes said yes. Eleanor looked at the carpet between her feet. She thought about it for one long moment. Then she lifted her head. Mr. Hayes, she said, I would like to retain you. I am going to write you a check today for $10,000 drawn against funds. I will explain to you in a moment. I would like you to file a motion to dismiss Mr. Marlowe's injunction. And I would like you to do it if you will permit me to be plain in the most aggressive language you are professionally capable of writing. Lawrence Hayes did not smile, but the corners of his eyes shifted very slightly the way a hawk's eyes shift when it has sighted something interesting in the long grass below. Mrs. Brennan, he said, I would be delighted. There is one more thing, Eleanor said. I would like you, after I have signed the retainer, to drive with me to Bangor this afternoon, to the First Maine Savings Bank. There is something inside a deposit box there that I believe will substantially change your view of this case. Lawrence Hayes raised one eyebrow. Mrs. Brennan, he said, may I ask what? I think Eleanor said you would prefer to see it. She walked out of the offices of Hayes and Whitcomb with a signed and retainer agreement in her coat pocket and a strange, unfamiliar feeling in her chest. It took her walking down Exchange Street into the wind a full block to identify what the feeling was. It was not relief. It was not safety. It was, to her quiet astonishment, the first faint stirrings of anger. The vault room of the First Maine Savings Bank, in the basement of a marble-floored Beaux-Arts building on Hammond Street, was the quietest room Eleanor had ever stood in. The walls were lined with brushed steel deposit boxes. A bank officer in a charcoal suit had escorted them down. Bartholomew Ashford had met them at the door. An armed guard stood very politely in the corner, with his hands folded in front of his belt. Lawrence Hayes had been told on the drive up only that what he was about to see related to the case. He had not asked questions. That, Eleanor suspected, was part of why he was the most aggressive property attorney in the state of Maine. Bartholomew Ashford turned the key. He drew out the long, heavy deposit box and laid it carefully on a velvet-topped table at the center of the room. He stepped back. Mr. Hayes, he said, please. Lawrence Hayes lifted the lid. He did not gasp. He did not exclaim. He was not a man who gasped or exclaimed. He stood for a long moment looking down into the deposit box, and the only sign that anything in his world had shifted was a single small movement of his throat as he swallowed. He looked up at Eleanor. Mrs. Brennan, he said, I see. He drew on the cotton gloves Ashford had laid out. He lifted the leather-bound ledger from the top of the collection. He opened it on the velvet. He turned the pages slowly with the careful reverence of a man handling a primary source he had until that morning half believed was a folk tale. He turned to the back of the ledger. He paused. He reached very gently into the back inside cover of the ledger. There, tucked into a small leather pocket, sewn into the binding, was a folded sheet of heavy paper. Hayes drew it out. He laid it flat on the velvet. He smoothed it with his gloved hand. It was a federal land patent. It bore at the top the seal of the United States Department of the Interior. It bore at the bottom the signature of an Assistant Secretary of the Interior, a notarized impression, and a date. The date was the 11th of October, 1928. The patent recorded in clear, unambiguous language the conveyance to one Cornelius Whitfield of 1 Hollow Pine, Penobscot County, Maine, of an additional 50-foot buffer zone surrounding the existing structure on his property. The purpose recorded in the patent's cover letter, also still folded into the ledger pocket, was to prevent encroachment by adjacent timber operations on what the document discreetly described as private structures of considerable personal value. Lawrence Hayes read the document twice, then a third time. When he looked up, his cut glass eyes had taken on a quality Eleanor had not yet seen in them. It was not pleasure, it was something more focused, something more dangerous. "Eleanor," he said, "Mr. Marlowe's 1952 survey is not just flawed. It is by every indication on this document a fabrication, a forgery, drawn up almost certainly by a rival timber concern in the years after Cornelius Whitfield disappeared to lay claim to land that had legally been deeded to Whitfield more than 2 decades earlier under federal seal. A federal land patent properly notarized supersedes a county survey. A federal land patent from 1928 supersedes a county survey from 1952 by 24 years." He drew a slow breath. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, "you do not just own the farmhouse and its contents free and clear. According to this patent, Mr. Marlowe's recently constructed driveway on Lot 45 is built on your land." He looked at the document again. He looked at her. "Who," he said, "signed the 1952 survey for Mr. Marlowe?" Eleanor did not yet know the answer to that question. But Lawrence Hayes was a careful man and a thorough one, and 3 days later, with the courthouse records ordered up under formal subpoena, he placed the answer on his desk in front of her. The signature on the 1952 survey, the survey on which Thaddeus Marlowe was basing his entire emergency injunction, the survey he had inherited from his father who had inherited it from his father, was in a careful, upright 1950s hand. Silas Marlowe, Chief Surveyor, Marlowe Timber Holdings, Hollow Pine, Maine, May the 17th, 1952. Silas Marlowe had been Hayes confirmed by the end of that same afternoon, the founder of Marlowe Timber Holdings, the principal regional rival of Whitfield Lumber in the late 1920s, and the grandfather of one Thaddeus Marlowe, presently of Bangor, Maine. Eleanor looked at the document on the desk for a long time. She looked at the looping signature, Silas Marlowe. The grandfather had drawn up the forgery. The grandson had inherited it. The grandson had sat in the second row of an auction gym in Hollow Pine, in his charcoal coat with his styrofoam coffee, and he had laughed at a condemned farmhouse that his own family had spent 70 years quietly trying to acquire, because his own family had known all along what was hidden inside its walls, or part of what was hidden, or at least that something was. Eleanor lifted her eyes from the document. "Mr. Hayes," she said quietly. "Mrs. Brennan." "How long," she said, "has Thaddeus Marlowe known?" Lawrence Hayes folded his hands on the desk. "That," he said, "is a very good question." Outside the windows of his office, a light snow had begun to fall on Exchange Street. The Christmas lights were going up 2 weeks early on the lampposts of downtown Portland. A young couple walked by hand in hand laughing about something. In a corner office in a glass tower in Bangor, 60 miles to the north, a heavy-set man in a charcoal suit sat at a wide mahogany desk and looked at a photograph that had just been sent to his phone by a private investigator named Carl Reese. The photograph showed Eleanor Brennan walking out of the offices of Hayes and Whitcomb on Exchange Street with a leather folder under one arm. Thaddeus Marlowe looked at the photograph for a long time. He set the phone down untouched on the surface of the wide mahogany desk. The thing about a man like Thaddeus Marlowe was that when he had decided what he was going to do, he preferred in the end to do it himself. Outside his window, the snow was coming down harder over the city of Bangor. It was falling also on the long pine country to the north, and on the dirt track of Ravenwood Road, and on the broken roof of a condemned farmhouse, where a tire iron lay on a kitchen floor in a small, clean square that one woman had cleared 2 days ago for herself. The story was no longer a story about a widow and a $7 farmhouse. It had become somewhere in the last 72 hours something much older than that. It had become a story about a debt that two families had been carrying without knowing it for 97 years. And it had become for the first time a story in which Eleanor Brennan is not the one who was afraid. The mediation hearing was scheduled for 10 in the morning on a Friday in a small conference room on the third floor of the Penobscot County Courthouse. Eleanor wore that morning a navy wool suit that Lawrence Hayes' secretary had picked out for her at a department store on Congress Street. The suit fit her better than anything she had worn in 2 years. Her hair cut for the first time in 14 months by a stylist on Exchange Street fell just below her jaw in a clean line. She wore no makeup beyond a touch of color on her lips. She did not need any. She walked into the conference room with Lawrence Hayes one step behind her left shoulder and Bartholomew Ashford, who had come up from Bangor to bear witness to the documentary record, one step behind her right. Thaddeus Marlowe was already seated. He sat at the long oak table in the same charcoal suit he had worn to the auction. He had a fresh styrofoam cup of coffee in front of him. Beside him sat his attorney, a slick man in a sharp black suit named Bradford Vance, who had flown up that morning from a Boston firm whose name Eleanor recognized from the newspapers. Marlowe did not stand when Eleanor entered. He looked at her instead. He took her in. He took in the navy suit and the cut of her hair and the steady line of her shoulders, and his face moved very slightly, the way water moves when something has dropped into it from above. He had expected Eleanor understood the woman from the back of the auction gym. He was looking at a different woman. He recovered. He smiled. His smile was wide and comfortable and did not reach his eyes. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, "please, sit down. Let's see if we can keep this civil." Eleanor sat. Hayes sat. Ashford remained standing by the door, his hands folded in front of him, very small and very neat. Bradford Vance opened a leather folder. "My client," he began, "is prepared to make a generous offer to resolve this matter without the expense of continued litigation. Mr. Marlowe is willing to compensate Mrs. Brennan for the surrender of her deed in the amount of $1,000. That represents a return of approximately 14,000% on her $7 investment. We trust she will recognize the courtesy." Marlowe leaned forward, elbows on the table. "That's a nice, warm bus ticket, Mrs. Brennan," he said. "Wherever you'd like to go, maybe somewhere south, somewhere with palm trees. You don't strike me, if you'll forgive me, as a woman with much taste for a Maine winter." The room was silent. Lawrence Hayes did not look at Marlowe. He opened his briefcase very calmly with the same patience he had shown reading Cornelius Whitfield's ledger by halogen lamp 3 weeks before. He removed a thick stack of high-quality photocopies. He slid the stack across the polished oak surface of the table halfway and stopped. "We decline your generous offer," Hayes said. Bradford Vance frowned. "On what basis?" he said. "On the basis," Hayes said, "of this." He pushed the stack the rest of the way across the table. Vance picked up the top sheet. He read the first paragraph. His face did not change. He read the second paragraph. His face changed. He read the third paragraph in silence. He turned to the second page. He turned to the third. By the time he reached the fourth, his hands had gone very still. Marlowe beside him was watching his attorney's face. He did not yet understand what he was looking at. He reached with the unconscious habit of a man who has spent his life used to being the one who knew first and picked up a copy of the document for himself. He looked at the seal at the top. He looked at the date. He looked at the signature at the bottom of page 3 where Silas Marlowe had signed his name in a careful, upright 1950s hand 68 years ago on a survey that had just been positively identified as a fabrication. Marlowe's neck began to flush. The color climbed slowly from his collar into his face. "That document," Hayes continued in the same quiet, even voice, "is a federal land patent conveyed to Cornelius Whitfield by the United States Department of the Interior on the 11th of October, 1928. It establishes beyond any reasonable challenge that the structure on Lot 44, the entire structure, sits within a 50-foot buffer zone of land legally and federally deeded to Cornelius Whitfield 24 years before the Marlowe survey was drafted. Mrs. Brennan owns the farmhouse, the buffer, and everything within them, free and clear." Hayes paused. "Furthermore," he said, "we have reason to believe, based on the signature on page 3 of your client's 1952 survey and on records of the Marlowe Timber Holdings corporate registry of the same period, that the survey your client has filed in this matter is a forgery originally executed by your client's grandfather, the late Silas Marlowe." Vance closed his eyes briefly. "As such," Hayes said, "we will be filing by the close of business this afternoon a countersuit on Mrs. Brennan's behalf. The counts will include real property encroachment, civil trespass, fraud upon the court by means of a forged historical instrument, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We have, as you may have seen on your way, in a press contact from the Bangor Daily News in the lobby downstairs. We will be releasing a public statement at 1 o'clock. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that comes into a room when a man has just understood very suddenly that he has lost. Thaddeus Marlowe stared at the federal land patent. His jaw worked. His knuckles around the edges of the photocopy had gone white. He rose very slowly to his feet. He picked up the photocopy in his right hand and crumpled it deliberately in his fist. He let it drop to the table. He looked at Eleanor. His pale, comfortable eyes had become, in the space of 2 minutes, very small and very dark. "You," he said. The word came out low. "You think this is over, Mrs. Brennan?" Eleanor met his gaze. She did not look away. "I think," she said quietly, "that you should leave Mr. Marlowe." He laughed once. It was not the laugh from the second row of the gym. It was a tighter, harder sound. He looked for a moment as if he might say something else. Then he turned and knocked his chair back hard enough that it skidded into the wall and walked out of the room without taking his coat. Bradford Vance gathered his papers. He did not meet anyone's eyes. "I will," he said in a voice that had become carefully professional again, "be in touch with my client's instructions by Monday." He left. The door closed. Lawrence Hayes folded his hands on the table and looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, "that went by my private estimate considerably better than it had any right to." Eleanor nodded once, but her hands under the table were still pressed flat against her knees, and they had not yet stopped trembling. Because she had seen in the last second before Thaddeus Marlowe turned away what had moved behind his eyes. It was not embarrassment. It was not defeat. It was something a woman who had once made her living, finding the small wrong notes in long columns of figures, had learned very early to recognize. It was a man calculating his next move. Lawrence Hayes had advised the moment they walked out of the courthouse that Eleanor should not return to the farmhouse. Not yet. Not while Marlowe was still in motion. The collection was already safe. The iron box, the ledger, the gold, all of it sat behind brushed steel doors in the vault of the First Main Savings Bank in Bangor, where it had been for 3 weeks. There was nothing of monetary value left at Ravenwood Road. But there was, Eleanor told him, one thing. A small cedar music box. Not large, not valuable, 5 inches by 3. Declan had given it to her on their second wedding anniversary when they could not afford anything else. She had hidden it in those last frantic months before the eviction in the false bottom of her grandmother's dining table, and when she had sold the table to pay the most aggressive of the medical creditors, she had taken the music box out and put it in a paper grocery bag with the few other small things she could not bear to lose. The grocery bag she had left on her first night at Ravenwood Road on a high shelf in what had once been the upstairs hallway closet. She had not gone back for it. She wanted to go back for it now. Hayes, who had buried his own wife 8 years before, and who knew the way only widowers know what some objects meant, did not argue with her. He drove her himself. The early dusk of late November was already coming down over Penobscot County by the time they turned onto Ravenwood Road. The sky was the color of wet slate. The pines on either side of the dirt track stood tall and patient, the way they always stood. A thin skin of new snow lay across the clearing when they pulled up to the farmhouse, and the rusted Ford Taurus, which Eleanor had left parked beside the porch all month, had gone white on the roof. Hayes turned off the engine. "I will come in with you," he said. "Larry," Eleanor said, "I will only be a minute. The closet is at the top of the stairs." Hayes considered this. He looked at the farmhouse. He looked at the long empty driveway behind them. The road back toward Hollow Pine was a single ribbon of disturbed snow, the only set of tire tracks on it their own. He did not like it, but he was a man who had learned over 40 years of practicing law when to listen to a woman who had already made up her mind. "I'll wait here," he said. "If you are not out in 5 minutes, I am coming in. If anything at all feels wrong, you turn around and you walk back out. Do you understand?" "I understand." She got out. She walked across the clearing through the new snow up the broken porch steps. The front door, which she had jammed shut with a wedge of pine after that first night, opened to her shove. She stepped inside. The house in the dust smelled the way it had smelled 4 weeks ago. Mildew and dust and old wood. The hole she had broken in the kitchen wall on the night of the box still gaped open in the dim light. A square of plastic she had taped over it had come loose at one corner and hung down fluttering very softly in some draft she could not feel. She turned on her flashlight. She started up the stairs. The stairs creaked under her weight. She had been up them only twice in her life, both times in daylight. She kept the flashlight beam steady on the steps. She reached the upstairs hallway. The closet was at the far end on the right. She walked toward it. She was halfway down the hall when she heard the front door open behind her downstairs. She stopped. She held her breath. It was not Hayes. Hayes would have called out. The footsteps that came in across the warped living room floor below were heavier than Hayes's and slower, and they were the careful, deliberate footsteps of a man who was trying and not quite succeeding to be quiet. A second creak, the shift of weight on the lowest tread of the stairs. Eleanor did not move. She thought for one moment of running, of going to the upstairs window at the end of the hall and waving down to Hayes in the car, but the window had been boarded over on the inside with a sheet of plywood. She would lose 10 seconds tearing it off. 10 seconds was a great deal when a man was already on the stairs. She thought instead the way she had learned to think, the way a forensic accountant thinks. She thought about the building. She had spent 11 hours on her hands and knees in this house in the early days before the bank vault, before Hayes, before any of it. She had cleaned every inch of the kitchen floor. She had walked the upstairs hall 3 times. She had noticed with the careful attention of a woman who was about to sleep on the building where every soft place was, where every weak board groaned underfoot, where the floor of the upstairs hall between the closet and the head of the stairs dipped a full half-inch because the joist beneath it had rotted clean through 90 years of Maine winters. The board second from the wall, 3 steps from the top of the stairs, was the worst of them. It bent under her weight when she crossed it. She had stepped around it every time. A heavy man in heavy boots who did not know the house would not step around it. She turned off her flashlight. She moved very softly, 3 steps backward, until her shoulder blades touched the wall at the far end of the hall by the closet. She slid down to a crouch. She set the flashlight carefully on the floor beside her. Out of her coat pocket, she drew the only thing she had thought to carry up the stairs with her, the small folding knife Declan had carried in his pocket for 23 years, and which she had carried in hers every day since the funeral. She did not open it. She held it closed in her right fist. Footsteps on the stairs. Slow, heavy. A breath at the top of the stairs. A voice. Low, thick. The voice of a man who had been drinking, but not enough to be careless, only enough to be brave. "Mrs. Brennan." It was Thaddeus Marlowe. Eleanor did not answer. "Mrs. Brennan," Marlowe said again. "I know you're up here. I saw you go in. Your lawyer's a careful man, but he's not a young one, and he's outside in his car, and we're going to have a conversation, you and I, before he comes looking." A pause. "I just want to talk." Eleanor heard the small, distinct click of a hammer being drawn back on a revolver. "Just to talk," Marlowe said. "Come on out into the hall." He took 1 step forward off the top of the stairs. He took a second. He took a third. His foot came down on the second board from the wall, 3 steps from the top of the stairs where the joist beneath had been rotted through for 90 years. The board gave with a sound like a tree breaking. Thaddeus Marlowe dropped. He did not drop the way a man drops when he has tripped. He dropped the way a man drops through a floor. The rotted board collapsed. The joist beneath it, already weakened, sheared cleanly. His full weight, all 260 pounds of him, went through the upstairs hallway into the room below, with a long crashing tear of splintering wood and falling plaster, and the heavy hollow boom of a body striking the warped boards of the kitchen 1 floor down. He screamed. Eleanor stayed very still for a moment against the wall. Then she rose. She walked very slowly, very carefully around the long, jagged hole in the floor of the hallway. She did not look down through it. She did not need to. She could hear from the kitchen below the high, thin sound of Thaddeus Marlowe trying to breathe through what was, by the sound of it, a broken leg and probably broken ribs. She walked the length of the hall. She opened the closet at the end. The brown paper grocery bag was still there on the high shelf exactly where she had left it. She took it down. She tucked it under her arm. She walked back along the hall, around the hole, down the stairs, across the living room, through the kitchen where Thaddeus Marlowe lay on the floor in the wreckage of the ceiling, his revolver 3 feet from his hand, his face gone the color of paper. He was alive. He saw her. He opened his mouth to say something. Eleanor did not stop. She walked past him, picked up the revolver carefully by the barrel, using the corner of her coat, and walked it out the front door with her. She set it gently on the porch railing. She walked across the clearing. When she got to the car, Lawrence Hayes already had his cell phone in his hand and the words 911 dispatch on his lips. "He's in the kitchen," Eleanor said. Her voice was very even. "He has a broken leg. The gun is on the porch. Tell them to send an ambulance. He is not going anywhere." Hayes looked at her. His mouth, for the only time she would ever see, hung open. He raised the phone. "Yes, dispatch," he said. "We have an intruder down with injuries at 402 Ravenwood Road. We require police and an ambulance." In the distance, a long way off, through the great pine quiet of the November woods, the first far thin sound of a siren had already begun. Maine State Police Detective Patrick Sloan took Eleanor's statement at the Hollow Pines substation that night in a small, wood-paneled room that smelled of coffee and old paint. He was a tall, lean man in his late 50s with steady gray eyes and a habit of writing in slow, neat block letters in a small spiral notebook. He let her speak without interrupting. He did not press her. He thanked her when she finished as if she had done him a favor. The investigation that began in that room would, in the 8 weeks that followed, expand in ways no one, including Lawrence Hayes, had quite predicted. Thaddeus Marlowe was charged the morning after the incident with first-degree criminal trespass, criminal threatening with a dangerous weapon, and aggravated assault. His attorney filed for bail. Bail was denied. The judge, a 62-year-old woman named the Honorable Margaret Holcomb, observed from the bench that the defendant had broken into a private residence in possession of a loaded firearm with the apparent intent to confront the homeowner, that he had been the subject of an active civil countersuit at the time, and that in her professional opinion, he posed an active danger to the public. The 1952 Marlowe survey was formally vacated by the court on a Tuesday in early December. The 1928 federal land patent of Cornelius Whitfield was formally entered into the public record of Penobscot County the same afternoon. The Bangor Daily News ran the story above the fold under the headline, "The $7 Farmhouse." Eleanor declined every interview request. She gave instead a single brief written statement through Hayes's office. It read, "I bought a house at a county auction. I am grateful to the people of Hollow Pine, to the Maine State Police, and to my counsel for ensuring that what I bought I was permitted to keep. I have nothing further to say at this time." The statement was reprinted over the following weeks in 17 newspapers across New England. Letters began to arrive at Hayes's office. Eleanor read every one. Most of them were from widows. 6 months after the auction, on a clear afternoon in early May, Eleanor Brennan walked into the auction floor of Sotheby's, New York, on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. She wore a simple dark dress. Her hair was up. Bartholomew Ashford, in a fresh gray suit, walked one step behind her left shoulder. He had insisted on accompanying her. He had also insisted very gently that she sit in the third row on the aisle, where she could see the bidding paddles rise but could not be seen by the bidders. The room was full. The Whitfield Hoard, as Sotheby's catalog had styled it, had drawn collectors from London, from Geneva, from Hong Kong, from Sao Paulo. 3 of the highest grade 1928 $1,000 gold certificates in known existence were in the lot. 11 uncirculated 1907 St. Gaudens high-relief double eagles were in the lot. The leather-bound ledger of Cornelius Whitfield, intact, was in the lot, sold separately to a research library in Maine on Eleanor's specific instruction for $100,000 below its likely market value. She sat very still in the third row on the aisle as the auctioneer's gavel rose and fell. She did not raise her own paddle. She watched instead the faces of the men and women across the room who did. She watched the small tightening of a jaw when a coin went for more than expected. She watched the slight nod 2 rows up of a woman in a green silk scarf when she finally let the bidding go on a stack of certificates she had wanted. The final hammer fell at 9 minutes past 4. The total realized after taxes after the commissions of Sotheby's and of Bartholomew Ashford and of 2 appraisal firms was $4,200,000.17. Bartholomew Ashford turned to her in the soft hush after the room emptied. "Eleanor," he said. She looked at him. "Yes, Bart." He hesitated. He was not a man given to displays of feeling. He had been a child in Maine in the years just after the war, the youngest son of a coin dealer, and he had been raised in the New England way to keep his face and his words small. "I think," he said, "it has been the privilege of my career." Eleanor reached out very simply and took his small, dry hand in hers. She held it for a moment. "Thank you, Bart," she said, "for not robbing me." He gave a small, startled laugh. It was the only time in their 50-month acquaintance that she would see him laugh. "My dear," he said, "it would never have crossed my mind." She did not buy a mansion. She did not buy a yacht. She bought a small cedar shingle cabin on the south shore of Sebago Lake, 26 miles outside Portland, on a private gravel road that had no street sign at the entrance. The cabin had 2 bedrooms, a screened porch, a wood stove, a stone fireplace, and a long view of the water that on certain mornings in early summer lay so still that the white pines on the far shore stood doubled perfectly in its service. She bought it for $340,000 in cash. She bought also a 1-year-old Subaru Outback in dark green for the snow. She did not sell the Ford Taurus. She drove the Taurus at the end of June the long way out to the cabin with the windows down and her hand resting on the warm, sun-bleached vinyl of the dashboard. She parked it in the small detached garage behind the cabin. She turned the key off. She let the engine tick one final time into silence. She did not lock the garage door. She did not need to. The Taurus would sit there with its rust along the wheel wells and its tired blue paint and its broken heater for the rest of her life. She left a small framed photograph on the dashboard of the Taurus behind the wheel. It was Declan. He was leaning against a kitchen counter in their old apartment on Cumberland Avenue in his gray sweatshirt holding a coffee cup. He was smiling at her, the small, private smile he had reserved for her for almost all of the 11 years they had been married. She closed the garage door behind her. She walked across the long grass to the cabin. She slept that night for the first time in a bed that belonged to her. She established the Declan Brennan Foundation in July. The foundation's mission was a single sentence: to purchase and forgive the medical debt of terminal patients and bereaved families across the 6 New England states. Lawrence Hayes drew up the papers. Eleanor served as president. The board was small. Bartholomew Ashford agreed to serve as treasurer. A widow Eleanor had met through one of the letters that came into Hayes's office. A retired schoolteacher from Vermont named Adelaide Whitcomb agreed to serve as secretary. The foundation was funded with $2.5 million of her own money and a quiet promise to refresh the endowment annually. The work was simple in concept. Medical debt in the United States was traded on a secondary market for pennies on the dollar. A foundation with a checkbook could purchase the debt of 1,000 families for the price of one good medical bill, and then instead of collecting on it, simply forgive it. The families would receive a single envelope in the mail. The envelope would contain a 1-page letter on cream-colored paper embossed at the top with the name Declan Brennan Foundation. The letter said, "Your medical debt has been purchased and forgiven. You owe nothing further on this account. We are very sorry for what you have been through. You are not alone. With sympathy, Eleanor Brennan on behalf of the foundation. In the first 6 months, the foundation forgave $11 million of medical debt across New England. In the first year, it forgave 28. By the second year, it had forgiven 64. Eleanor read every thank you letter that came back. There were a great many of them. It was a Tuesday in early May in the third year after the auction. The light at the end of the parking lot at Mercy Hospital in Portland fell gold across the asphalt at 5 in the afternoon. The early summer leaves on the hospital's two old maples moved softly in a small wind off the bay. A robin was singing somewhere on the low fence by the loading dock. Eleanor parked the green Subaru in a visitor spot. She got out. She had a manila envelope in her right hand and a small set of keys in her left. She had come to Mercy that afternoon as she came once a week to deliver the foundation's debt forgiveness letters by hand to families whose situations had been flagged by the social workers. It was the part of the work she did herself. It was the only part she did not delegate. She walked across the lot slowly, the way a woman walks who has after a long time come back to a place that once meant the worst thing that had ever happened to her, and who has decided by coming back to mean something else by it. She stopped near the second row beside a tan Honda Civic that was older than the green Subaru by a decade. The Civic was packed full. She did not need to look twice to know what she was seeing. A pillow in the back seat, a folded blanket on the passenger seat, a plastic toiletry bag in the cup holder, a grocery bag of clothes on the floorboards, a small framed wedding photograph propped on the dashboard. A young woman sat in the driver's seat. She was 28, perhaps, small, thin. Her hair was pulled back in a quick ponytail. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, although the engine was off and the keys were in her lap. She was looking very steadily at nothing. Her face was the face of a woman who had been crying for so long that the crying had stopped without her noticing. The name on the social worker's note in Eleanor's pocket was Marigold. Eleanor stood for a moment on the warm asphalt in the late afternoon light. She felt in the small bones of her chest an old familiar quiet. She tapped very gently on the passenger window. The woman in the driver's seat turned. Her eyes were very large. She did not at first understand what she was seeing. Eleanor mimed with her hand the rolling down of a window. The woman lowered the window 2 inches. "Yes," she said. Her voice was the smallest thing in the world. "My name is Eleanor Brennan," Eleanor said. "I have something I would like to give you. May I sit down for a moment?" The woman hesitated. She nodded. Eleanor walked around the front of the Civic, opened the passenger door, and slid into the seat beside her. She closed the door very softly. The interior of the car smelled as Eleanor had known it would smell of an old air freshener and stale fast food and something else, something deeper that was the particular smell of a small space in which a person had been doing all of their living for too long. Eleanor did not look at her. She looked instead at the dashboard where the photograph stood. A young man, a laughing young woman, a wedding day sometime in the last 5 years. "What was his name?" Eleanor said. The young woman did not ask how Eleanor had known. "Henry," she said. "How long?" Eleanor said. 9 weeks. Eleanor nodded slowly. "Cancer," she said. "How did you know?" the young woman whispered. Eleanor turned finally and looked at her. She did not answer the question. Instead, she set the manila envelope very gently on the center console between them. "Open it later," she said. "Not now. Tonight in the room I am about to give you the keys to where there is a bed and a kitchen and a door that locks." The envelope contains a letter. The letter says that the $87,000 Mercy is currently asking you to pay has been bought by a foundation from the hospital's collection account and forgiven. You do not owe it. You will never owe it. No one is going to call you about it again." The young woman's mouth had begun to tremble. Eleanor opened her left hand. She set the small set of keys on top of the envelope. "This key," she said, "opens the door of a furnished apartment on Munjoy Hill. The foundation owns it. It has a kitchen and a bathroom and a bedroom and a window that looks at the harbor. It is yours rent-free for as long as you need it. There is food in the refrigerator. There are sheets on the bed. There is a small framed picture on the wall in the front room that you may take down if you don't like it. The address is on the tag of the key." The young woman did not speak. She had begun to cry very quietly, the way Eleanor had cried 3 years ago on the cold, rotted floor of a kitchen in a condemned farmhouse on Ravenwood Road. "How," she finally managed. Eleanor smiled very small. She thought for one bright, clear moment of Declan in his gray sweatshirt, of Jesse, the boy at the Exon, sliding a dollar bill quietly back across the counter on a winter night, of a farmer in a green John Deere cap lowering his hand in the back of an auction gym in Hollow Pine, of Bartholomew Ashford pulling on his cotton gloves, of Lawrence Hayes laying a federal land patent flat on a velvet table, of a wind in the eaves of a house where a wall 90 years closed had finally opened. 3 years ago," Eleanor said quietly, "I sat in a parking lot like this one. I had a husband I had just lost. I had a car packed full of everything I owned. I had a fortune in medical debt I could not pay. I sat in that car for a long time." She paused. "Somebody," Eleanor said, "gave me a house when I needed one. Now it is my turn." The young woman, Marigold, looked at her. The two of them sat in the front seat of an old tan Honda Civic in the parking lot of Mercy Hospital in Portland, Maine, and they did not say anything else for a long minute. The light came in through the windshield gold, and slow and very late. The robin on the fence by the loading dock was still singing. In the small detached garage of a cedar shingle cabin on the south shore of Sebago Lake, 26 miles to the west, the rusted blue Ford Taurus of the year 2006 sat in the silence, in the cool. On its dashboard behind the steering wheel, a framed photograph of a tall, soft-spoken man in a gray sweatshirt smiled the small, private smile he had once smiled for almost all of the 11 years he had been a husband. It would be there, that photograph, for the rest of Eleanor Brennan's life. A great many things in the end had been taken from her. A great many things in the end had been given back. And a great many by her own slow, patient hand in the small, clean square she had once cleared for herself on a rotten kitchen floor had been given after that away.